So we're just going to turn this a little bit. Yeah. Well, that's got the railing in it now. It's going to be hard to see that spoon.
What's the image reverse?
Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, the camera is backwards.
I don't. How are we going to attach it? No, it's. Yeah, it's got to be like that. I don't know why it's reversed. Can't see the text anyways. Yeah, I don't have any way to edit this. It doesn't like that before, though. Right. Yeah, it's not amazing.
Yeah, definitely. But if it was like text,
I don't know. I didn't literally change nothing last time we had this.
was it not the one?
No, this is the right side. That screen was on the right side. Oh yeah, 3 people watching.
You're watching my phone. The tube stream is backwards.
I mean, we only have 3 minutes anyways. All we have is options for chat. Let me film.
Should we do end stream and then do it?
I feel like he's going to start talking very soon. Someone keeps joining and then quitting.
Yeah, but it's going to be a big problem if we continue with this.
I think Paul sent out one yesterday, but like, if you look for a YouTube channel, what's it called?
Did you send it to us?
I sent it out yesterday. P&B McMaster.
There's the PMB Master?
Yeah.
Okay.
Symmetry splits, for example.
Oh, that's hilarious.
But it wasn't when we tested it.
Yeah.
It didn't change anything, and now it's mirrored.
That's
But
funny.
you can't see the screen anyways.
So next time you have to talk.
Okay, you said PMB Master?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna try it.
So what am I supposed to do?
Okay, right there.
Somewhere for you. Okay. That's all we can finish. On the occasion of the 10th annual Margo Wilson Memorial Lecture, I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Martin Daly. Martin got his PhD from the University of Toronto in 1971, where he was studying the maternal behavior of hamsters, and then he spent the next couple of decades studying the desert rodents. But he's most well known for his work on the causes of human violence, where he applied an evolutionary perspective and therefore was able to discern patterns that nobody else had seen and to identify this fact. He joined the faculty and within the fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Working on the founders of the field of evolution, they founded the Human Behavior and Evolution Society and the president of that society. And they were also the editor on a personal note, I can still remember the first time I met Martin. I celebrate them and work and it's not an exaggeration to say Martin and Mark are the reason that I'm here at the master. And today Martin's going to tell us about spousal homicide, dreary consistencies, and encouraging changes.
Mic on? Okay. I've been fighting a cocktail of bugs, and I'm hoping my voice lasts until the end, but I can talk to the whole voice. Yes. Margo Wilson considered this department her academic home from 1978 until her death. I had the good fortune to be her partner for more than half of her life. And during the 1990s, Margo discovered much of what we know about spousal homicide, by which phrase, in case anybody wonders, we're encompassing men killing their wives, their husbands, whether registered marriage or de facto or common law marriage. What I'm going to talk about today is what is persistent in spousal homicide since Margo did her, I think it is fair to say, seminal work on the subject 25 years ago or so, and some things that have changed. And you may take heart from the word encouraging there. But I'm going to talk about Margo a lot. I have a hard time believing that it's actually 10 years since her death. There are a number of people in this room who were very fond of her, who were dear friends. Some of them have actually come a long way to be here. And so this is going to be very much a memorial lecture in a way that previous Margo memorial lectures have not been. And I realize most of the people in this room are students who never knew Margo. I beg your indulgence. I think you will see data and interesting stuff, despite the focus on the person. Let's see, how shall I? There's Margo Wilson as a kid in the Arctic, about 100 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, where she grew up in Fort McPherson with a beloved Cocker Spaniel named McGinty. Margo's mom was the nurse in the Gwich'in community of Fort McPherson. She was the only non-Aboriginal student in a one-room primary schoolhouse. If you're in a one-room primary schoolhouse, by the time you're in grade 6, your primary job is to teach the grade 1s and 2s. So this was not an ideal place to complete your education, especially since there was no high school. So Margo left there to go to high school in Victoria, BC, living with what was in effect a foster family and returning to the north to be with her mother in the summers. After completing high school, she entered the University of Alberta. And she originally wanted to be a nurse, like her mom. But she bridled at the sexist practices of nursing profession at that time. Men were not admitted to studying nursing. Married women were not admitted. If you were discovered to have been secretly married, you were expelled. All the students had to be in their dorm, and there was bed check every night, and they better be alone. And she quit before Christmas and went into psychology. And while in psychology, she got a job in an embryology lab, part-time job in an embryology lab, and her interests turned more physiological. And so by the time she graduated, she wanted to do what we would now call behavioral endocrinology. In those days, people said hormones and behavior. And so she went to the University of California at Davis to do her master's degree, and then University College London to do her PhD, castrating male monkeys, a useful skill, and doing hormone replacement therapy and seeing what it did to behavior. When Margo completed her PhD in 1972, her supervisor wanted her to stay on as a badly paid postdoc in the lab for a couple of years, and she refused that offer, and he was pissed and refused to write her any letters for any jobs or anything. So she had no sponsor, and in those days, a sponsor was more important than a long publication list, actually. Your PhD supervisor called up people they knew and said, I've got a good student. So Margo moved to Toronto, got a job as a typist at the Royal Ontario-based museum, not mentioning she had a PhD. And over the course of the next 2 years, she wheedled her way into the University of Toronto Psychology Department as what we would now call a session, teaching sort of a course at a time and being paid by the course. Somehow, in that period, she managed to get an NRC grant, forerunner of NSERC, for monkey research to set up a squirrel monkey lab, a squirrel monkey colony and lab at the University of Toronto, all without a real job. And that's when I met her. And we fell together in 1975, and shortly thereafter, I got a job in California. Margo had nothing to stay in Toronto for, really sort of job security, 6 months at a time. And so she came with me. and had a couple of underpaid sessional jobs in California while we were there for 3 years. We came to McMaster in 1978. Again, I had a job, she did not. And the culture at that time was very opposed to spousal hires. They were felt to be sort of nepotistic and wrong. And so I had a job in this department. Margo was a contributing member of this department, published many papers here, supervised undergraduates, co-supervised all of my graduate students, but had no job. She accomplished an enormous amount in this time. I'll tell you about homicide research in a little while. We got a hold of an archive of homicide research in which we were very interested in the determinants of differential sentencing. And Margo said, to really understand what the judicial profession thinks they're doing, I think I better go to law school. So in 1986, the University of Toronto was just starting a new Master of Studies in Law program for people with PhDs in social science. It was an insanely intensive 1-year program where you took first-year law courses, second-year law courses, third-year law courses, and graduate law courses all in the same year with the law students, and had to get at least a B. And Margo broke her ass at that and got the first MSL from the University of Toronto. She was the only student who sat out. She got her Master of Studies in Law from the University of Toronto in 1987. And while she was here, without an academic position, she got a string of SSHRC grants to study homicide. She was elected president of the Human Behavior and Evolution Society. Finally, in 1997, I guess, an eminent member of this department, Shepard Siegel, who was the only member of the department who was a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, pleasantly surprised us by nominating both of us for the Royal Society. And we were elected. We were the first couple to ever be inducted in simultaneously. And I think somebody in the administration said, you know, we've only got a handful of FRSCs in the university, and one of them is some woman I've never heard of. And they created a position for her, and so for the last 11 years of her life, she was a professor in this department. Margo was full of ideas and enthusiasm, and some of the ideas were pretty zany. One of the most zany was that we should study homicide. This didn't come completely out of the blue. We had done some work using archival data to show that children living with step parents were at higher risk of child abuse than children living with both their birth parents. And an obvious concern as soon as you get a phenomenon like that is maybe there's a reporting bias or a detection bias that's not a real difference. But when we looked at the lethal cases of child abuse, which should presumably have minimal, if any, reporting and detection biases, you find the differential even larger. And this idea that homicide could be a window on sort of social conflicts and the conflicts characteristic of certain social relationships was something Margo took on board and said we should study homicide more generally as a way to test relationship-specific conflict hypotheses about that. I thought that was pretty zany, but it gets sillier. She said, and we should study it in the city of Detroit. It's just down the road. It's got more homicides every year than the whole of Canada, which was true. They're all investigated by a single police department, so if you can just get in there and into their investigative files, then you can get a lot of data. And so there's the city of Detroit across the river from Green Windsor to the north of Windsor, baffling everybody. And we wrote a letter to the chief of police of Detroit and said, hey, can we come rummage around in your homicide files for research purposes? And we were incredibly lucky. The chief of police, who was sort of a figurehead really in public things, passed this along to the deputy chief of police, who actually ran the place. And that was this guy, James Bannon. He had a PhD in sociology. And he raised us, you know, this is web days, so we write him a letter and put it in Canada Post. He writes us a letter back and says, come on down and talk about it. So we went down to Detroit, we met this guy, sort of could tell he was a simpatico person. I mean, he's a cop and he's got a gun strap here, but he's also got on his desk a little thing saying, Dr. James Bannon, take 2 aspirins and see me in the morning. And he sort of got the drift that he was a human being. And also then when he started complaining about the fact that the Police Foundation had ripped off some of his data, we thought, this is our kind of person. So anyway, he introduced us to the head of the homicide division, and there we were just sort of ankle deep in the investigative files of homicide cases. And they're rich, they're full of information, but I'm talking about spousal homicide. We settled on a 1-year sample of homicide cases. We settled on 1972, even though this was 1980, because all the cases that had happened in 72 that were going to be solved were solved. They'd all been adjudicated to that time, and it seemed like a good one. There were 690 homicides in Detroit in 1972. There were 521 in the whole Canada that year. All the files were there in this one police department. 512 of these cases have been solved. In 80 cases, the differential were spouses, whether in a registered marriage or a de facto or common law marriage. 36 men had killed their wives and 44 women had killed their husbands. And I see a couple of them. And yes, that was kind of startling and interesting, and we will come back to this point of what Margo called the sex ratio of spouse killing. I'm going to review a few of Margo's contributions, and then I'm going to tell you what's changed. So one of Margo's contributions was to identify demographic risk factors, like risk in relation to age, in relation to the age disparity of a couple, some other things. At this time, homicide research had been dominated by sociologists who were interested in predicting gross rates of homicide in units like cities or states of the US or countries from gross social indicators for those same places. And that's a very worthy and worthwhile enterprise, and I sunk into it myself. At the time, nobody had addressed questions that are more like epidemiologists' questions. Who's at risk from whom? What's a risk factor to an individual? And so we plunged into that. No one had investigated the effects of age on risk, for example. I had a hypothesis. I thought men value women for their reproductive value. The older women will incur the most risk. Men will be most recklessly disregarding of their well-being in a conflict situation or something. I confess I was perhaps unduly influenced by a couple of or 3 very prominent cases in the news around that time. You may remember the Premier of Saskatchewan, Colin Thatcher, who took out a contract on his middle-aged wife in order to take up with a younger woman. Millionaire developer Peter Demeter in Toronto, who'd done exactly the same thing. And actually, there was a guy here in Hamilton who owned a string of funeral parlors who'd done exactly the same thing, and that was in the news too. So this was my hypothesis. Margo said, no, you're an idiot. What men are doing is they're using violence to coerce and control wives. The lethal violence is the tip of the iceberg of, if you like, more functional, coercive violence. And it's the young wives they're most concerned to control. Well, whether her reasoning was right on that, her prediction was a lot better than mine. Here are homicide rates. Uxoricides, by the way, means killing wives. So let's say spousal homicides when I'm talking about either direction. Uxoricides when I'm talking about the killing of wives. Here the killing of wives is a function of the wife's age. Uxoricides per million wives per annum, or a set of data from Canada. And I'd just like to do a little shout out, actually, the middle author here, Holly Johnson, who was an analyst at Statistics Canada at the time. She subsequently went and got a PhD in sociology and now is a professor at the University of Ottawa. But Holly was the person who invented and ran Stats Canada's Violence Against Women survey, which was a model for such surveys and copied all over the world. And Margo was very good at forging collaborations with people who background was different from ours. She certainly wasn't an evolutionary biologist, and she was not a psychologist for that matter. But we got on well and got some interesting comparisons. This paper is actually a comparison of risk factors for lethal and non-lethal violence against wives. Now, if you're looking at this, and if I am putting you to sleep, some of you are thinking, well, yeah, but why should I believe that's an effect of the wife's age? I mean, young women mostly married to young guys. Young guys are the most dangerous demographic category. You all know that. They kill other guys disproportionately too. So maybe it's really a husband's age effect. There may be something to that, but at the very least, it's much more complicated than that. And I'll illustrate this by talking about the very youngest category of women who are at the most risk. And what risk are they at as a function of their husband's age? Because some women are married to men much older than them. So killing of young wives as a function of the husband's age, there are data for Canada. You marry an old guy, watch your back. And this is one illustration of the fact that age disparity is another risk factor. Now, that's just Canadian data. We managed to assemble appropriate data for a couple of other comparisons for New South Wales, Australia, just because we could get the data we needed for these places and for the whole of England and Wales. And although not as dramatically as in Canada, they tell the same story. Young women are actually more at risk from older husbands than they are from, age concordant husbands. So this is the kind of thing I'm talking about when I'm talking about identifying and quantifying demographic risk factors. When we started doing this, no one was doing it. Very soon thereafter, the Surgeon General of the US, a guy named Deborah Koop, pronounced violence a public health problem and gave a mandate to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta to study violence, which lasted until some Republican administration decided that they shouldn't be doing that. That wasn't really a public health problem. So actually, we found the epidemiologists very quickly as our best colleagues and used to go to epidemiology meetings. Another really important thing that Margo pioneered was quantification of the elevated risk associated with separation. Everybody in the women's shelter movement, the battered wives movement knew that the immediate aftermath of a separation was a really dangerous time. But nobody had systematically reviewed the literature of all known spousal homicides in various jurisdictions and what proportion of them are estranged, much less what would you expect. This was our best effort to answer that. We again had the Canadian data, the New South Wales data. Now we've started working in Chicago instead of Detroit. And we had data for the city of Chicago. This is the likelihood that your husband, or the risk that your husband will kill you if you're co-residing with him. This is the risk that your husband will kill you if you left him. And by left, I mean, the denominator here is all women whose official marital status is separated or divorced, which is sort of the best we can do for a denominator, but it doesn't really get at just how bad this contrast is, because that includes people who've been separated for years. But in fact, most of the action happens in the first couple of months after separation, and sometimes on the day of. So still, this was an important first effort at quantifying this sort of thing. And Margo made a number of other contributions. She headed up a project showing that the United States was uniquely weird in its spouse killing ratio. That you saw the data from Detroit. In that case, women kill men actually more, their husbands more often than vice versa. This, we could find nowhere else in the world where this was true. And tried to analyze some reasons for it in this paper. But this was an important thing to show because the similar numbers of bodies were assumed by some criminologists and family violence researchers to be indicative of equal violence by husbands and wives, which I'll get back to in a minute. Margo also headed up a project distinguishing two types of familicides, and by familicides I mean killing the wife and kids together in a collective event. And the two types were some guys who do this are depressive, and they've lost a well-paid job or something, solid middle-class guys who've got a stay-at-home life, and they're suicidal, and they're going to take the family with them because, after all, how could you leave them behind? And the other category are guys who are accusatory and angry at the woman and her parasitic brood, and they're never suicidal, essentially. But the common denominator of these two things, when you think about it for a second, is that in both cases, men construed women and children as theirs to be disposed of as they saw fit. And the concept of male sexual proprietariness, tendency to treat women as property, was something that Margo got very interested in, especially after going to law school and studying the law of property and seeing that how historically much of the law of marital entitlement was derived directly from that, or indeed invoked that very directly. So the idea that men are sexually proprietary animals who, stake out a woman as their property and consider the interest of another male or her interest in another male as a violation of their rights and their ownership rights, was an important idea. And actually, that's the idea that most caught, non-evolution minded, sociologically trained homicide researchers. So the journal Homicide Studies is the principal journal of the Society of Weird People Who Study Homicide. There has only ever been one memorial issue for a former member of the society who died, and that was for Margo, a special issue in honor of Margo in 2012. I'm sorry if that's not visible. It wasn't really meant to be. The point is that there was a special issue, and the idea of male sexual proprietariness was the thing that seemed to fire up enthusiasm among other researchers with different backgrounds. Let me illustrate what I'm talking about with the first study of spousal homicide that was ever conducted in Canada before we started. And that was done by this guy, Peter Chimbos, who was a professor of sociology down the road at what was then the University of Western Ontario, or specifically Brescia College there. He wrote this little monograph called Marital Violence, a Study of Interspouse Homicide. It's a good read to this day because he interviewed these 34 convicted killers of spouses, 32 of them while in prison, 2 of them shortly after they were released. And there's a lot of rich stuff in this monograph, but he also did some sort of standardized interview as well and asked people exactly the same question. And one question was, what was the main source of conflict in your marriage? And here's the total distribution of answers as categorized by Chimbos. Sexual matters, 29, excessive drinking, 3, and well, there really wasn't any conflict in marriage. And that's it. That's the exhaustive list. It's kind of fascinating. I mean, many of these people are not particularly well-to-do. No one's pointing to financial matters. Most of them had children. Nobody's pointing to child-rearing conflicts. This is it. And from the interviews, it's very apparent that what sexual matters essentially means in every interview he quoted at length, which he said were representative of all of them, was that men blamed the killings on their wives' infidelities, and women blamed the killings on their husbands' assaultive accusations of infidelity. But it's the guy in either case who is claiming the partner has been unfaithful, and usually she ended up dead in this example, and sometimes he did. And excuse me. few studies other than this one would show you quite such a predominance of this motive category. But they all show you a predominance. Every study we can find will show you a predominance of it. Quite early in our interest in these topics, Margo and I and Suzanne Leghorst, a student named Suzanne Leghorst, wrote a paper on male sexual jealousy where we tried to review all the literature on the subject, especially anthropological literature on homicides of spouses, and just confining your attention to thorough samples, like not cherry-picked stories, but all the cases that occurred in some city in some year or something like that. We found that what we call male sexual jealousy, which we broadly defined to encompass both the preoccupation with sexual fertility and also intentionally believing. We found that accounted for at least 65% of the cases in studies we could find, and often more. Ostensibly, maybe there's other stories people, maybe these are self-serving after the fact stories or something, but this was the case in a large majority everywhere. And then, as I said, Margo wanted to take this idea and slightly rethink it in what she called male sexual proprietariness, the tendency to treat women as property. And particularly in a review chapter, we summarized this in connection with legal history and so on. And this was sort of supposed to be a playful allusion to the recently popular Oliver Sacks essay, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Chattel. Now, there's a distraction. Male. This idea that, in fact, marital violence is a two-way street. There are people who would write, the problem isn't violent men, it's violent couples. And the principal perpetrator of this idea was a guy named Murray Strauss. And Murray headed up a family violence research institute at the University of New Hampshire. He had a large number of students, and probably most of the people working on family violence in academic settings in the United States in the 80s and 90s and 2000s had gone through Murray's institute. And he invented something called the conflict tactics scales in collaboration with his colleague Richard Daly in particular. They were concerned with the sort of subjectivity of words like violence and so on. And they thought they could solve this problem by asking people very behavioral questions. Have you pushed your spouse in the last year? Have you slapped your spouse in the last year? Have you threatened your spouse with a weapon in the last year, etc.? And the finding from such studies, national probability sample surveys in the United States in 1975 and 1985, Strauss and Daly summed up like this. Within the family or in dating and cohabiting relationships, women are good at violence. One of his students, Suzanne Steinmetz, went so far as to proclaim the existence of a battered husband syndrome. Now, there was the phrase battered wife syndrome, which Lenore Walker had popularized. It's gone out of fashion because I think most people studying these things and feminists and the shelter movement and so on thought it had a tone of victim blaming. She's got a syndrome, or at least, pathologizing the victims of violence by saying they had a syndrome. But at the time, people talked about battered wife syndrome. And Suzanne proposed that there's just as many battered husbands out there as battered wives, but we just don't see them because they're too ashamed to admit. And they have their survey. And they have the equal body counts in the US on spousal homicide. Here's an exemplary kind of quote that you would see in the literature in those days, and in fact still will. Women are more prone than men to engage in severely violent acts. Each year, more men than women are victimized by their influence. And of course, as in all American-centric sociology and criminology, they're actually just talking with the US. But that's okay. The conflict tactics scale studies have been done in many countries, including Canada and elsewhere. And it's true, they consistently turn up Murray's results. Well, we used to hear Murray and his students, we go to their paper sessions at the American Society of Criminologists, and they drive us crazy and we ask pointed questions. And a couple other people who did the same are these two, Rebecca and Russell Dobash, who are the authors of a classic work called Violence Against Wives, a case against the patriarchy. I'm not always fond of the way people toss the word patriarchy around. I think they tossed it around quite appropriately, actually. I could talk about that some more later. But Russell and Becky were criminologists in the UK. They were heavily involved with the women's movement, with the establishment of shelters for abused women. They're kind of heroes to a component of the women's movement at the time. And they'd sit in this audience and fulminate and ask pointed questions too. Well, there's nothing like a common enemy to make friends. And even though their backgrounds were very different from ours, Margo says, I forgot this. She said, when we first met them, Russell and Becky referred to us as positivists. And we didn't realize that was an insult. But anyway, we sort of became buddies because we were driven nuts by the same stuff and we're converging on the same complaints about it. So there's the four of us, Russell, Rebecca, Margo with no sunglasses for a year, and me at a criminology meeting in New Orleans in 1992. And we got together and tried to refute this. And I think we did so very successfully. In fact, I think we devastated it, although there are people who don't believe that. In this paper, a paper that was called The Myth of Sexual Symmetry in Marital Violence, we pointed out a couple of things, a few things. The most important of which in the present context are that those conflict tactic scale measures have zilch reliability. In studies in which people have separately asked husbands and wives, both the perpetrator and the victim, forms of these questions, there's like no concordance. There was one study where there was negative concordance. There were men who claimed to have beaten their wives. There were women who claimed to have been beaten. There were women who claimed to have beaten their husbands. There were men who claimed to have been beaten. And there wasn't a single case in which there was a claim of perpetration and a claim of victimization by the spouse. I mean, these measures are crud. Treating them as valid because they're more behavioristic. It's like still self-report. And there's a massive amount of reason to suppose that self-report data are particularly vulnerable to problems in the domains of violence and sexual behavior, but probably violence even more than sexual behavior. And there's no reason to believe them. They had no inter-observer or inter-participant liability, so they can't have validity. Liability is a sine qua non for some validity. Anyway, we pointed this out, and at the same time, this stuff of the uniqueness and the peculiarity of American homicide data. One reason the coin starts to drop later when this ain't so symmetrical. In the Detroit data I showed you on the first slide with the numbers on it, and in other studies, about 3/4 of all women who killed their husbands were not charged with the crime. And essentially no men who killed their wives were not charged with the crime, except for those who committed suicide. And the reason they're not charged with the crime is because they can provide evidence of previous hospital admissions for being abused by the guy, or there's a plausible self-defense story that a jury is going to buy. And busy prosecutors aren't going to bother trying to prosecute, or maybe they're even actually genuinely sympathetic. So that numerical balance was very misleading. One more little tangent about an empirical phenomenon. I mentioned at the beginning about stepchildren being at excessive risk compared to children living with both birth parents. It occurred to us that, well, that should mean that women with children from former unions might also be at elevated risk. Stepchildren are a source of conflict, whether because the woman wants more invested in her kid than the guy is inclined to do, or whatever they're arguing about. If that's a source of conflict, you might expect that having stepchildren in the home would be one as well. we first tried to tackle this question, there were no suitable data sets. Things like the big stats Canada data included all homicide and stuff. You couldn't find out people's reproductive histories or household compositions. So we set about doing it here in Hamilton, because every spousal homicide, I mean, you can find every spousal homicide in the Stats Canada data and confirm that they were all reported in the Hamilton Spectator, that there were accounts of the cases and information, and possibly information again at a trial if it came to trial. And it took us a long time to accumulate much data because there's only about 1.5 spousal homicides per annum in Hamilton. Thank you. But here are the results of accumulating data on this question for 22 years. What is the probability or the incidence of being killed by your partner? This is just women who have minor children in the home and the partner in the home. They're the only ones we're considering. So childless women might be killed by their husbands, they're not included. If the children are all sired by the current partner, there's a certain risk of being killed. If you have at least one by the current partner and at least one by a former partner, that jumps up. And if you have children only by a former partner, it jumps up a lot more. And this has since been replicated in the US and elsewhere. But it was the first demonstration of this phenomenon. And it turns out to be interesting in another context, which I'm going to turn my attention to now. And that is this. Here's a wicked problem, as I say nowadays. Predicting lethality in abusive relationships. There's been a lot of interest in this problem because there's no sense wagging your finger at women who are abused and go back to their abusers. You want to be helpful, do things like present them with information and inform their decisions. And why it's a wicked problem is the same risk factors for non-lethal violence. Stepkids, female youth, de facto union. Surveys tell you that these are all risk factors for non-lethal violence. They're also risk factors for lethal violence. Women who tackled this question first, and still is in some ways, Jackie Campbell, who's a nurse on faculty of nursing at Johns Hopkins University. And she set up a very effortful sort of matched case study of what are the attributes of women who are killed by their husbands, what are the attributes of women who have been abused by their husbands who are matched in some way in US cities. And she found three things that are predictive of lethality in abusive relationships. The first was if there is a gun in the home. The woman's beaten, but if there's a gun in the home, she's more likely to be killed. If they have a history of separations, which is an interesting one, separating, reconciling, don't do it. It's a risk circumstance for violence, and it's over and above that, a big risk factor for lethal violence. And the third one, which again is a risk factor for violence, but a bigger risk factor for lethal violence, was her child, his stepchild in the home. Now, actually, there were a couple other things that were aspects of the abuse itself, which were also predictors, having choked her in the past episode. But Jackie included this because we were talking at these violence against women sessions at the American Society of Criminologists and convinced her that this should be added as a predictor. Okay, pretty grim news so far. So I want to give you some good news. Here are data on rates of spousal homicide in Canada for the last 40 years, over a 40-year period. Female victims in red, male victims in blue, victims per million, persons at risk per annum. We're including both registered and de facto unions, and it's stunningly down. I mean, the trend downward is quite striking. The women are being killed around 2015 at a third the rate they were 40 years earlier. And the men it's an even bigger proportion of that. And they seem not to be a risk at all, hardly. If you look at the US, you see something similar, but interestingly different. Here are US data And here I've used intimate partner homicides because for technical reasons about what's available in FBI data and whether it's any good. So this includes boyfriend, girlfriend, and also the denominator is just adults of each sex. But you got a long downward trend, most dramatically in the males. And the consequence is that back there in the 1970s, in the mid-70s, women were about as much as likely to kill their husbands as vice versa in the US. I used the past tense when I mentioned that fact earlier because it ain't true no more. The US has become a normal country in this one regard. How come? Well, one thing that's really nice about the US is they're divided up into 50 states and other kinds of units, and they implement policies and things asynchronously. So if you can figure out how to do the analytic methods right, you can ask questions about what's affecting something by comparing how many shelters per million women were available in these cities at different times. When did they institute mandatory arrest of abusers? Because it used to be the case that if, the police are called into a domestic, as they say, they'd ask the woman, do you want me to arrest him? I'm like, she's got to live with this guy in the future. What did she say? But mandatory arrest, we don't care what she wants, we're arresting him if there's evidence of violence. This was instituted in a number of places. And there's decent evidence that a lot of this drop is due to the implementation of these resources for abused women. Probably the best paper on this topic is this one, which appeared in a journal called Feminist Criminology a few years ago. If you are perhaps like me, inclined to suspect a priori that a journal called Feminist Criminology is going to be more rhetoric than data, read the paper, it's good. And what's interesting is what they've shown is that domestic violence resources clearly protect men, less clearly and probably less dramatically protect women. You think, well, that's a bit of a head scratcher, except when you think about it, there's some sense to it. Because the women who killed their husbands were typically victims of abuse, acting after a long period of abuse, arguably in self-defense. Well, there's an alternative to stabbing the bastard if there's a women's shelter. There are other ways out. And so the irony seems to be that if you implement these resources for abused women, you actually save more male lives than female lives, but you save both, which is interesting. I think I've got time to do the next 3 slides. I wasn't sure I would. I've been living in New Zealand for the last few months, and I've been getting into New Zealand homicide archives. Turns out there's a homicide archive maintained by a news organization with the name Stuff, which doesn't sound promising. You think it's all going to be clickbait or something, but actually they're a very respectable news collection agency, and they put together a file of all the cases. They're actually modeled on something that the LA Times does now. If you want to look at homicide cases in LA, individual cases are all online with details. So Stuff's put together this homicide archive. It only goes back to 2004, and because New Zealand's a small country, I mean, I think they just topped 10 million population. I've sort of reduced a bit of the jitter here by lumping these into 3-year categories. It looks like something similar maybe going on in New Zealand, that there is a decline, at least in female victimization rate, that they too are enjoying a reduction in spousal homicide or intimate partner homicide. There's a lot of things about homicide in New Zealand that look just like what we're used to in North America. Got 117 uxoricides in New Zealand in this sample. Male sexual proprietariness is a dominant motive or trigger in at least 65% of these cases, and there's enough of them that we actually don't know much about that it's almost certainly higher. Estranged women are at the greatest risk. 41% of the victims have left their killers, and another 4% were in the process of doing so at the time they were killed, essentially half the women. Now, I don't have any relevant population of large data to compute rates. This is clearly more than you would expect often right after separation. Some of these cases are on the day of. Some more are in the week after. Stalking is prevalent. Emma mentioned stalking. At least 15% of the victims here, the women who were killed by their husband, had taken out a protection order against him. And, you know, that's a piece of paper. It doesn't do a lot for them, necessarily. And I haven't mentioned overkill either. An overkill means administering conspicuously more damage than would have been necessary to kill the person. Like stabbed her 207 times, or, you know, broke 38 bones and beating her to death with a baseball bat or something. Overkill is prevalent, as it is in spousal homicides elsewhere. Men are angry. Suicide is prevalent. 21% of the killers had committed suicide of men who killed. And this is like essentially the only category of homicide where the killers commit suicide at the scene or immediately afterward, except for depressed mothers killing children after their infants. They also are suicidal, but otherwise, any category of homicides you can dig up. Suicide's pretty rare, but here we've got 30% of the guys tried it. The botched attempts, you know, can't just say it was fake or something. I mean, guy shot himself in the head and didn't manage to kill himself, you know, things like this. Younger wives are at the greater risk. I won't show you data, although maybe less dramatic than in North America. Age disparity is almost certainly a risk marker. 24% of the couples were at least 10 years apart in age. Again, I don't have the relevant population at large data yet, but I'm sure that's got to be a larger proportion than in couples generally. At least 42% of these 117 victims had a child sired by a previous partner, which is, again, you know, I don't have a relevant population of a lot of cases. And again, the at least means there may be more. And actually, this and child victimization data both suggest that New Zealand shows a bigger difference between step families and genetic families than we see in North America in terms of risk to both the woman and the kids. And de facto marriage is a risk marker. 62% of the victims were in common law or de facto unions, compared to 22% of couples in the population at large. So if you do this sort of ratios in your head, that comes up to about a six-fold greater risk for women in de facto unions than registered unions. And that's exactly what we initially found in Canada, six-fold excess risk. But there's an interesting story about change there, too. Some of you will remember Bridie James, although you may not recognize her. Bridie said, assure anybody here who knows her that they shouldn't be alarmed by the short hair. She just got tired of expensive haircuts and being hot in the summer in Brisbane, Australia, where she lives. Bridie did her master's thesis in this department a number of years ago, and she demonstrated an interesting phenomenon that nobody had known about. There used to be excess, so cohabiting is the same as what I said, called de facto. So the top two, the squares, if you can see that that's what they are cohabiting women and cohabiting men. The bottom two are, or the circles are registered marriage women and registered marriage men. Over this period from 1990 to 2005, what's remarkable is the difference has disappeared. The excess risk in de facto relationships has disappeared from being like a six-fold difference to nothing in a sort of steady process. And also, most of the reduction in spousal homicide, most of the action seems to be in de facto union. Bridie tested a lot of hypotheses. The first thing that springs to mind is, well, de facto unions are normalized and legitimized to a degree now that they were in the past. Maybe they're just more like registered marriages. Maybe they're less different. But at least in terms of income, educational level, age distribution, the differences are exactly the same at the end of this period as they were at the beginning between registered and de facto unions. So it ain't that. What is it is interesting. Bridie also unpublished but in her master's thesis, produced similar data for Canada. And she didn't publish it because she wasn't sure of the reliability of some things. And the data are a little noisier, but they seem to be telling much the same story. A convergence of de facto versus registered marriages. So that the difference has largely disappeared, and perhaps even more dramatically here than in the US, there's really not much trend in the registered marriages, although this actually does amount to something dropping males down to essentially nothing. The action seems to be mostly in a de facto union. Well, these are things for you to think about. What the hell does that mean? What explains these declines in spousal homicide rates, these differential declines in spousal homicide rates? I think a large part of the answer must be the shrinking legitimacy of male sexual proprietary. Now, it may sound funny for a guy who has sort of been arguing that male sexual proprietariness is a cross-cultural universal and all that, to say this, but that doesn't mean that men act on these things in a vacuum. There are societal supports for men to feel entitled to control their wives. When do you think men lost the entitlement in the UK to forcibly to confine a wife who wanted to leave them? It was after Russell and Becky started their work in Scotland. It's 1973. I remember, I'm an old guy, I remember when I was a kid, nice white collar men making disparaging jokes about women and thinking that was sort of a funny thing to do. And I can certainly remember hearing not so much from the nice white collar men, the sort of bragging to each other about how they had to give their wife a smack in order to get her into line or something like that. I think the universe within which you can brag about that kind of shit has just shrunk. There's fewer and fewer guys who think this is something to be proud of, a normal one to chuckle about. And when I say legitimacy matters, it's partly that if you spend any time rummaging around in homicide files, you discover that most homicide offenders think they're moral agents. They think they're acting righteously, that the victims have done wrong and deserve their fate, and especially in marital homicide. These guys aren't just a bunch of Hamadryas baboons or something. They're morally indignant about something. And then if the social framework that supports moral indignation over things like women wanting to control their own lives starts to fall away, then I think the felt entitlement and indignation to behave violently falls away. If Margo Wilson were still among us, I'm sure she'd have lots of ideas about these questions. I suspect she'd even have some zany ideas about how we could test them. But alas, she no longer does walk among us. Thank you. Who's the chairperson? We have Daly here. I can take some questions as Mel, who is the chairperson. Yes. Thank you. I really can't answer that. There are certainly same-sex couples homicides, both sexes. Some of them are perpetrated in the context of one party wanting to leave and the other being controlling, including lesbian cases. but I've never been into a data archive where there are enough of them to say much about them. And the male-male cases, in particular, I think a fair few in the police files, and you sort of can't tell because they didn't treat these like registered unions or unions. So a fair few cases in the police files are actually some guy who's a trick who, lures another homosexual man. He may himself not even be homosexual to rob and kill him, and things like that happen. And they're called homosexual partners. And it's so the database is pretty crummy, or was some years ago when I tried to look into this. It may have gotten better. There may be some good studies coming forward, but I'm not sure. Jonathan.
Thank you for the talk. Not a very good question, but I'm very curious. There were two murderers who said there was no conflict in their marriage. I'm curious.
What did they mean?
It's a great.
I think they were both men, but I'm not sure. I think they were both men. And it's like, there was no conflict. They used to whack her a bunch, and one of these times they killed her. But they didn't have any conflict.
They didn't put the toilet seat down.
Nobody dominated that source of major social space. Oh.
Stepchildren and children who have been in relationships for them to have violent behavior against their children.
I don't know about the step case. There's anecdotes. I know people personally who have been stepchildren who felt mistreated by their step-parent and who felt the lesson that they derived from that was they must never treat a child that way. There's certainly a body of literature that says that there is transmission of parent-to-child violence from generation to generation. And there's also a body of literature that says, yeah, but it's actually quite a surprisingly small effect. And specifically vis-a-vis the step ones, I can't say.
My understanding is that at least in the United States, that on all sorts of crime and violent crime in the 70s or something. I'm just wondering how you think the trends you discussed relate to that. Are they describing the way with violation, or is this something?
Well, it actually isn't since the 70s. I mean, homicide in the US, overall homicide rates peaked in 1980 at the highest they have ever been since they've had decent data, rose in the late 70s, dropped in the early 80s, rose again to almost exactly the same peak in the 90s, then came down a bunch through the 90s and into the early 2000s, and went dead flat and seemed to have risen a little in the last 2 or 3 years. So it doesn't track closely. And the proportion of all cases that are spousal, as well as the incidence, has been going down. But so I assume there's some different factors, but I'm happy to believe that there are also some common causes too. I don't think anybody can answer that, exactly what those are and provide a good demonstration of it. Well, you certainly read such cases, but to some extent, I think men construe young wives as the important alienable property. They're attractive to other guys. They're possibly more interested in change. They have more options. Older women who are divorced or widowed have very low remarriage rates compared to same age men. And I think it's just, men think young women are the thing they want to lock up you on. For that reason. Yeah. That's a super question. I'm embarrassed to say I'm not sure of how synchronous these things are. Some of the literature, I alluded to Amy Rechtenwald's, oops, no, it's farther down. No, it's farther up. Martin, wakey. Rechtenwald and Parker's study about what things in different states are predictors of declines and the temporality of them. I can't remember if they included divorce rates. I bet they have citations in that paper to trends in divorce rates of the whether or not they closely parallel trends of this sort. I'm not sure the answer. Ruben. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know if you could hear back there. Ruben was saying that you can well imagine that non-lethal violence might actually be functionally coercive and serve a man's interest. Certainly, that's something that many women in the battered women's movement without an evolutionary thought in their head are also convinced that men use violence to control women, and they do it effectively. Why would they ever kill them? It's like, pulling the finger, allegedly trying to sequester and protect. This is crazy. Our argument has always been that people are pursuing goals that are it would be, wouldn't it? People aren't pursuing goals that are all that close to fitness. They're pursuing, they're responding to motives and emotions that have been selected so that their central tendencies are optimal. And that, lethal violence is like the tip of the iceberg of more clearly utilitarian, non-lethal violence. It's an argument. It's interesting about estranged lovers. Guys hunt down women who've left them. Sometimes, quite often, if you read a bunch of homicide archives, this woman has left him. It's an intolerable insult. He's said as much. He hunts her down, he kills her, he commits suicide at the scene, and he's washed. And you say, this is not a mentality. This is not action that could possibly be fitness enhancing. It's got to be a byproduct of a mentality that, less extreme end of the distribution is fitness enhancing. That's the best I can do. Tony.
Have you thought about a similar kind of mentality that appears in different contexts? That's the case of men who view women as their property, and if they're not able to get that property, go on a killing spree, way of showing their frustration.
I don't know about the property part. I mean, I think the guys who can't get laid, they seem to have because I forget what their lingo is, but they often find violence against both the women and the men who are getting laid. That this is not fair and unjust, and we're discriminated against minority. And I used to be a crackpot, but now I can find other crackpots who think just like me online. I don't know that the proprietariness is much of an element. There's involuntary celibate, if you take that literally, it's involuntary unmarried. I think what's really meant is devoid of access to sex. The attitude that they deserve is, I take your point. The attitude that they deserve, are entitled to, that it's a moral outrage that they're not getting any, is certainly somehow akin to the entitlement of men locking up women in nursing school. No. That was women. Oh, hi. What's that? Oh, well, I don't. No sense asking.
And they make more money, they become better. They don't rely so much on the husband to provide for their kids.
Yes.
So, is that one of the causes? What kind of experience?
Well, certainly, this is really interesting, actually, because you might have thought that women's liberation in the domains of both work and sexuality, for that matter, would have made these problems worse, would have made them crazier angry. And in some cases, you read individual cases, that seems to be the case. And there have been some analyses that suggest that the woman making more money than the man is a risk factor for lethality. But, you know, it's also the other way. It's like these women can get out sooner of a relationship in which, you know, when you perceive you have alternatives, you can get out sooner. And I think the development of the support networks that encourage you to do so and will take you in is huge. So, yeah, I mean, you know, a first pass hypothesis from someone who thinks that male sexual proprietariness is the problem might have been that more women in the workforce, more dead women. But it doesn't seem to be going that way.
Sort of like the decline in people dying from brain injury, not the decline in people having brain injury. So how do the attempts to kill spouses look? And is this partly because we were just going to die?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I mean, an example of that kind of thing is that, you know, high homicide rates in the Northwest Territories and Yukon are at least partly due to the distance to the emergency room. What was only a stabbing turns into a homicide. So yeah, there are very nasty assaults against women that are not lethal in the data that I've seen, although mostly I see this when they eventually are. Has health response, medical intervention become more effective? And is that a component of why these things have declined? It's a great question, I don't think. I think we're done. I think they're fried. Thanks all for coming, especially those who came along the way. I really appreciate it.